Hi, in this video I'm going to show you how to create, debug, and deploy a serverless API. We're going to do all of this right inside Visual Studio Code. Now to follow along with this tutorial, you're going to need three things. One, a free Azure account which you can get by following this link. A copy of Visual Studio Code, you just need to download a copy of Visual Studio Code which you can get by following this other link. And then you need to download, or if you already have Node installed, that's fine. But if you don't, you need to click on this link to download Node.js, which basically comes with NPM as well. Since we're going to develop our serverless application locally, somehow something needs to interpret the code we've written, build that code, and basically give us an API to test our serverless project. That something is, in this case, called Azure Function Call Tools, and you need to install it. To do that, head to your terminal and run npm install -g Azure Function Call Tools. Then we need the version 3. I'm going to also throw in the unsafe PEM flag just in case anything goes wrong, just in case any security issue comes up. This will handle that for us. Now this is going to take a few seconds depending on your internet, maybe a bit longer, but I already have this installed. I'm not going to go through this process with you, so just go ahead and install this npm module. And once you're done, you can confirm your installation by running func version, which should give you the version number. In this case, I installed the version 3, so we'll have the version 3. Now that you have these call tools installed, you can actually go ahead and start scaffolding projects and testing them using the func command. So if I type func and hit enter, I would see a few help lines. The first one here is the start command, which helps you start the function project at a particular port, usually defaults to 7071. Then you can also scaffold a new function project, a new function, or you can create a new function project, and you can also take a look at your logs using the logs command. I promised you that we're going to do all of this using Visual Studio Code, because honestly doing all this from the terminal is not very convenient. So let's head to Visual Studio and start taking a look at how we can do all of this using Visual Studio Code. To do this in Visual Studio Code, we need to install the Azure Function extension, and to do that, click on the extensions icon on the activity bar and search for Azure Function. And you can see the Azure Functions extension. If you open it, you would see a few options here. In my case, I'm seeing the disable and the uninstall options because I already have this extension installed. I've been using it for a while. In your case, if this is your first time using this extension, you might be asked to install the extension, which would show up in a blue button. So just hit that button and you should be ready to go. Now, a few things you need to know about this extension is that it does a lot of things. You can use it to scaffold any project, use it to test your project, debug your project, and also deploy your project to Azure. It basically serves like an alias to that func command we saw earlier. It basically like gives you UI to run this. It gives you a GUI to run those commands instead of going to the terminal to do them manually. Once you install this extension, hit Command-Shift-P on Mac or Command-Shift-P on Windows to open the command palette. And when you open the command palette, look for Azure Sign In. Now, this is going to redirect you to a browser, to your default browser, and you can authorize VS Code to have access to your Azure account. I'm going to do this quickly. Once I do that, Azure would tell me to go back to Visual Studio Code because I'm already signed in. If I head back to Visual Studio Code, I can confirm that I'm signed in by clicking this Azure account, which would show me a list of all of my subscriptions. So this is blurred out because they are confidential information, but you should see your account subscription information once you log in. Now remember, you have to create an Azure account before you can log in, which I asked you to do at the beginning of this video. At this point, we can hide all this and start creating a function project. To do that, hit Command-Shift-P one more time or Control-Shift-P on Mac and search for, or rather Control-Shift-P on Windows and search for Azure Functions create function or create new project. you have two options here, either to create a function or to create a new project. I'm going to show you the difference between these two before the end of this video. But what we're going to do right now is to click on the create new project option. Now you'll be asked to pick a folder where you want this function to be created. In this case, I'm just going to create a random folder here and probably call it Serverless API. Hit create. It's an empty folder, and that makes sense because the VS Code extension is going to generate all the code that this folder needs. So at this point, we need to be empty. Now select this folder, and the next thing VS Code would ask you to do is to pick which language you want this particular function project to be set up as, or to be set up for. In this case, I'm a JavaScript developer, so I'm going to go with JavaScript, but you can, whatever language that works for you is fine. If you want to try this in TypeScript, C#, Python, Java, PowerShell, or even any other programming language like Rust, you can pick the custom handler and write in any language of choice. In my case, I'm just going to go with JavaScript for now to keep things simple. And the next thing we ask is to pick a template. Now, these are all different scaffold templates for Azure functions, but for our case, we're just doing a simple serverless API, so it makes sense that we pick the HTTP trigger template. Now, VS Code will ask you to give this particular function a name. This is different from the folder name we created. I'm going to help you distinguish between these two, but for now, let's just call it hello serverless and hit enter. We can pick any of these authorization level option, but basically what they mean is if you pick anonymous, it means that anyone, and literally anyone around the world, is going to have access to your API because it's public. Now, these other options are different security levels that you can pick. It's out of the scope of this video, but basically these two would protect the function and give you an API key that only people that have that API key can access this function. So we'll go with anonymous for now. And then lastly, VS Code or the extension will ask you, do you want to open this in the current window or open this in an entirely different VS Code window? This is a very simple decision to make. So in this case, I'm going to go with the current window because the current window is just a brand new VS Code window. Now, a few seconds later, VS Code would scaffold a project for you, launch the index.js, and I would walk you through what's going on with all these generated files right now. Now, remember when we had to make the decision to choose between creating a project or creating a function? Now, the serverless API folder we created is it's called the function project. The hello serverless here is called the function. And the difference is that the serverless API is basically a folder that contains all kinds of functions. It can be HTTP triggered function, it can be timer triggered function, whatever you like, or even like 1 million HTTP functions. So let's say see this as your project folder, like your repository, what you would push to GitHub that has all other functions inside of it. And you can see like very important files here, the .gitignore, a host.json. The host.json is basically a project-wide configuration. So every function, including hello serverless, that will create inside serverless API would be affected by this host.json configuration file. We have the package.json file, which is just a node package.json, which if you want to install dependencies into this project, this is where you would do that, or just run an npm install. One more important file you should know about is the local.settings.json. It's like a .env file. You just set all your environmental variables here and you can access them from your functions. Now let's head into the hello serverless function. This is a function now, different from a function project. Right inside the function, you would get two files, two very important files. The index.js file just contains your API logic. We'll come back to what this does. And then the function.json file is like host.json, but this configuration is only scoped to a particular function, in this case, the hello serverless function. So that means that if I create 1 million functions inside this function project, each of that 1 million functions would have a function.json where you configure what happens or the behavior of the logic file. For example, we can see the methods for this function, the allowed method. So if I set this to only get or to only post, that means only GET request or only POST request can go through this particular serverless function. Now let's jump right into the index.js and see what's happening here. First of all, you can see we're just exporting an asynchronous function, and this function takes a context and a request parameter. Now, both of these parameters give your function more information about what is happening with the particular request. So there are different ways you can make a request to a serverless API. You can either pass a body data, or you can just pass a queries. You can just set query strings, or you can set parameters. All these are dynamics that come in place when you're making a request to a serverless function or a serverless API. Now, the only way this function can know which exact thing is happening is through this context and request parameters we pass to it. And the first line here is basically just logging a simple information letting you know that this function has been triggered. And the next line is just checking, hey, is there a name in the query object or in the body? That's of course if the body exists. If there is, set it to this name variable, and then use that name variable to construct a response message. So if that name variable has an actual value, we would send back. We would set the response message variable with hello name or whatever we set in the query string or in the body. This HTTP triggered function blah blah blah, and then if that name wasn't set, we'll still say that it was successfully triggered, but you can pass in a name to personalize the response you would get. And at the end of the day, we'll use context.res to send back a response message using the body property. Now, you can see this status properties commented out because by default, if nothing goes wrong and you don't set a status property, the default would be 200. Now that we've made sense of what's going on here, let's try to run this project and test it locally. So to do that, click on the debugger icon from the activity bar and click on the run or the play icon, which would attach this particular project to the node process. Now you'd see that this starts, this basically does one thing, which is running this command func host start. Remember when I told you that extension we're installing also serves as an alias to the func or the Azure function call tools that we installed. That's what's going on here. It's just running func host start, and at the end of the day, it would give you a URL where you can test your API. Now let's copy this URL and see what happens. We'll copy this URL and paste it in our browser, and you can see here we did get the message that we're supposed to get if we don't pass in a name. It's asking us to pass a name in the query string to get a personalized response, which is what we're expecting to get when we don't set a name in the query or body, and we got this particular string as a response. And let's try setting a name and see if we can get this other response instead. To do that, just set a query string name equal to Chris and hit enter. And you can see we got a more personalized message that says, hello Chris, this HTTP triggered function executed successfully. Now, if you ask me, this is actually very, very exciting. Like it's intriguing to see that without going to the Azure website or using the Azure dashboard, I was able to set up a serverless API, test this serverless API, run it locally. All I just needed is just to install the Azure function call tool and to install the VS Code extension. I did promise you that I will also show you how to debug and deploy this function when we're done with it. So let's head right to debugging the function we've just created. Now, debugging is actually very, very, very simple and straightforward. In fact, we don't need to do any other thing right now except to just add a breakpoint somewhere here. I can remove this one. Now, once I refresh the browser, watch what happens. We immediately get redirected back to Visual Studio Code to actually see where the execution was paused. In this case, it was paused at this particular point where we're supposed to send back a response. Now, everything that happened before this point, we can dig in and see probably like what is set to the variables and every information that we need to know to debug our application, just in case something is going wrong. For example, you can see that the name variable is properly set to Chris, which is what we're expecting. The response message is properly set to hello Chris, blah blah blah, and which is basically what debugging means. Just making sure that getting more context into your execution process to make sure that everything is actually working as expected. If you want to learn more about how to use all of these debugging features, I'm going to link in the description because it's out of the scope of this video, but there's a link in the description that shows you how to take more advantage of everything happening in this VS Code debugger pane. Lastly, let's take a look at deploying this function so that you can have a production link to either share with your customers or share with your friends. First of all, let's stop all of this and just remove all of this so we can have less distractions. Cool. Let's head back to the file we're working on. You don't need to do this, but let's just have the file open. To start the deployment process, hit Command-Shift-P or Control-Shift-P on Windows and search for Azure Functions deploy. Yeah, we're looking for this first one, deploy to function app. Now, if you ask to pick a subscription, it just pick the default one that was created for you when you set up an account, or if you already had an Azure account, choose the one that you have the deployment access to. In this case, I'm just going to choose the one I have access to deploy to, and you'll be asked to either deploy this to an existing function if you have one, the existing Azure function if you want to. Let's say this is an existing project and you're just updating it, but in this case we don't have an existing project, so we want to create a new function app instead. Now this is very, very important. You need to choose a globally unique name. I will explain what globally unique means, but let's just choose Serverless API. Now there's a chance that this name already exists, or some other customer on Azure already uses this name as their serverless function name. If I deploy with this, I would get an error that this name already is being used by a different customer. That is what globally unique actually means. To avoid these errors, generally just add a random number at the end of this and you should be fine. Now hit enter. Next, the extension will ask you to pick a runtime. In this case, just go with the latest version of Node. And then lastly, we need to choose a location where we need to deploy this to. Most time you should choose the location closest to you, but in my case, I'm just going to go with Central US. And if you take a look at the bottom right of your Visual Studio Code, you should see the deployment is currently going on. This would take a few minutes. So I'm going to stop this video right here and I will see you once this deployment is done. Welcome back. Now, if you take a look at the bottom right of your Visual Studio Code, you should see that there's a deployment status that says that the deployment was completed. Now, to take a look at if it was successful, let's click on View Output. And of course, it was. We can see that there's a URL here which points to the production API, so we can copy it. Head to a browser and paste this and hit enter. Let's see if this actually works. And yeah, it does. We can also test for the name query as well. Name equal to Chris. And we're good to go. So we've just created, debugged, and deployed a serverless function using just Visual Studio Code. Like, we've done all of this without having to head to Azure or use the Azure dashboard. We are in our comfort zone without hurting our developer experience, and we're able to set up a brand new function project and deploy it. One last tip before we go though. I know this question comes up a lot, so I want to help address it before I end this video. Now, remember when I mentioned that there's difference between the function project and the function itself? Sometimes people struggle to see how they can add a function to the existing function project they've created. So in this case, how do you add more siblings to Hello Serverless, or how do you add a child to Serverless API project? To do that, just hit Command-Shift-P or Control-Shift-P one more time and search for Azure Functions create function. This is what we're looking for. So instead of creating a new project, now if you click on create function, you can pick a template, give that template a name. In this case, let's just call it Hello API. Choose the authorization level, and you can see we have one more function here, which is totally different from the hello serverless function we created earlier. So you can just keep adding functions to as much as you need. So at this point, you can just go wild. Try one thing I would like you to try is install dependencies and import them before your function and use those dependencies. For example, you can import things like moments.js and do like really fun stuff, like fun things, like just basically just go crazy with this whole thing. Cool. Now that's the end of this video. And if there is any other resource I think you might need while before I publish this video, I'm just going to link to it in the video description. So feel free to check that description and see if there's any other resource that shows you tips and tricks on deploying serverless to deploying your serverless functions using just Studio Code. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.